Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Joining me is senior managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all of our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now for today's episode. What most Latter-day Saint historians and other scholars know about D. Michael Quinn is that he was, by all accounts, a remarkable researcher who could assemble disparate dots into a colorful mosaic. They may know that he was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as part of the September 6 for his discussion of post-Manifesto polygamy and other controversial topics, or that he was an expert in the faith's financial dealings and hierarchy. But now, nearly 3 years after his death at age 77, the public will hear for the first time of his inner struggles as a gay man in the church that for most of his life preached that homosexuality was a sin. Signature Books has published Quinn's heartbreaking autobiography, A Chosen Path, a memoir, described as a relentlessly episodic look at the deeply personal agonies and ecstasies of his life and work, while offering his perspective on significant church events that occurred while he was writing about Mormonism. Three themes are thread through his entries: his relationship with himself as a closeted gay man, with his oft-absent and secretive father, and with his church. Here to discuss revelations about Quinn in the book is Moshe Quinn, his son, who wrote a foreword for the book, and Barbara Jones Brown, who edited the volume. Moshe joins via Zoom from California, and Barbara is in Salt Lake City. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with Moshe. In your foreword, you describe your dad as a tragic figure. Why do you think that?
Well, the center of that picture for me is his commitment to his faith, which was, as it turned out, his commitment to the Church of Latter-day Saints. And everything that he did from the age of 12, you could argue, was really informed by his commitment to the church, his love of the church, his belief in the church, and the mission of the church. At the same time, he had his own, you might say, idiosyncratic sense of what service looked like. For him, that service was truth-seeking and truth-revealing, especially truths that were not being discussed, truths that were being concealed, truths that were uncomfortable or awkward. And he felt, as he was a young man, discovering that there were certain episodes in the history of the church that were not being discussed and not being looked at. He thought that was a problem for the church. He thought that that could hurt the church when these things emerged, and it could be used as ammunition against the church by its critics or its enemies. So he felt really mission driven to dig into these awkward truths in episodes of church history, and he, you could argue that he really paid for it, that he fell. I mean, I think there's things that we could interpret as like, well, was that really tragic or not? I mean, I think there's a redemption angle to that story in terms of like he really was true to his principles and his values and indeed his faith, his relationship to God. And that's something that I think is very powerful and inspiring for me. At the same time, he suffered a great deal of pain and sadness from reprisals from the church and ultimately his excommunication in 1993. And that has always felt deeply tragic to me, being excommunicated by the church that you love for things that you did that were explicitly and always in service to the church and done out of love for the church. And that always seemed very tragic to me.
So to Moshe and Barbara, how did this book come about? Tell us a little bit about the process of publishing this posthumously.
Well, so I'll give a brief sketch on that, and Barbara will add important information. The book itself, the manuscript, was completed in 2010. It's dated as such, and he'd been working on it. Honestly, I would say he'd been working on his memoirs since he was in his early 20s. By his own account. With a serious commitment to journaling. With really his service to the church as like the through line for his personal journals. There's other strands as well that you touched on in the intro. But he was really working for decades to account for himself, to account for his life, to come to terms with the complexity of things that he was seeing and difficult decisions, that he had to make, and exciting opportunities, that he had to pursue. And I think of him as like a historian in this process. I think that he was sort of a historian in his bones. And so as he was like doing this self-biographying, if you will, or this self-accounting through his journals, he approached it like an archivist maybe, or somebody who was like really trying to account for things and document, his own account of his life. So he really started, from that time. And then it really came to this complete form by 2010. He shared CD-ROM versions at that time with us kids. It wasn't really on my radar at that time because I was just busy with life. I saw that he sent me a CD-ROM, but I put it in a drawer and then I kind of forgot about it. And he didn't ask me a second time, about my having received it or like what I thought about it. But he was in conversation with Mary a little bit, his oldest child, Mary, at that time. He shared it with a few friends and colleagues to see like what their thoughts were about it. And I believe he sent it to a few publishers. I don't believe it was Signature Books, but he sent it to some number of unnamed publishers around that time to see if they were interested. And we can only infer that they weren't because nothing came of those contacts at that time. And then when he passed away, it was sometime after that, as we were going through his personal effects and looking at the contents of his laptop, that we discovered that there was this complete manuscript that was there, and we'd heard from some people, in Mormon culture and in the scene of intellectual. Mormon intellectuals, some interest. We'd heard some people express some clear interest in any memoirs that he might have, and we reached out to Signature Books before too long. Signature Books has been a household name for us since the late '80s. When they published Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. And it wasn't too long, like I said, before we reached out to Signature Books to see what they thought about this manuscript, and if they thought it was a story that people would really be excited to see. We know that our father wanted to share it, and so we were excited to see that Signature was excited to carry it forward and bring it up to the world because it's an important story, and I'm excited that they were able to help with that.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. So I started working for Signature, succeeding Gary Bergera, who retired. And I started on March 1st, 2022. And I remember one of the first things as Gary was orientating me to the position, he brought me this manuscript and he said, and here's something we've recently received. It's D. Michael Quinn's memoir. And I was stunned because as a historian of Mormon history, I knew well who Mike Quinn was. I have cited him in my work on post-Manifesto polygamy. And I was stunned to learn that D. Michael Quinn had left a memoir. He had written a memoir. I was so excited to hear that. I looked back in our files and he actually had submitted an earlier version in 1998 to Signature Books. We still had the readers' comments and the readers basically said, this is a great start, but you really need to fill it in and add more about your feelings and thoughts about things. It was just kind of a skeleton memoir at that point in 1998. And based on the document, the manuscript that Moshe gave us, he did that. He did go back in and is very vulnerable, really shares all of his thoughts and feelings. But for some reason, there's no record. And I asked Gary as well, he never resubmitted it to Signature Books for publication during his lifetime. I do think it would have been published if he had resubmitted it. But we're just grateful that he left this last book for us, and we're thrilled to be publishing it and sharing it with the world now.
Yeah, and even after 2010, which is like his date for the conclusion of the memoir, timestamps in the files indicate that he was tinkering with it. He was making revisions and edits to it as late as 2019. So just a couple of years before he passed away. It was still something that he was, working on and occupied his attention.
Yeah. So Barbara, why the title of Paths? What did that imply?
Yeah, so Mike chose that title. He titled it himself, Chosen Path. So I love it's a great title. We just added a memoir afterwards, but I love that title. A, because he chose it, and B, I think it's a perfect title for the book. It just shows us this is the path that he chose. He chose, as Peggy, as you were saying earlier, the LDS Church, when he was young, taught that homosexuality was a sin that could be overcome. It was a weakness of the flesh, if you will. And so he believed that, he bought into that, and he chose the path of choosing to suppress his sexuality in order to follow the prescribed path for a devout Latter-day Saint man. He fasts and prays for days on end as a teenager, trying to overcome this so-called weakness of the flesh. He serves a mission for the LDS Church. He marries Moshe's mother in the temple. They have 4 beautiful children. He's serving in the church his whole life. That was the path he chose. But ultimately, it led to a lot of pain and heartache when he and his wife, Moshe's mother, Jan, finally realized that a mixed orientation marriage is not helping him, quote, overcome his homosexuality, and it's not bringing them happiness. They choose to divorce. Anyways, it's just about all of those kinds of choices he makes. And I want to point out really quick, too, that the picture on the cover of the book was taken by Moshe, the photograph, and it's a path. If you look closely, you can see some footsteps, 2 paths going off. And we just thought that was perfect, A, because we know Mike would have loved to have had his son's photograph on the cover of his own memoir. And B, Mike grew up in Southern California and loved the beach. And so it just seemed like the perfect photo for the cover.
So Barbara, let's dive into the book a little bit, the guts of the book. Talk about his patriarchal blessing and a conversation you had with the patriarch, what it said about and how he viewed it in his life.
Yeah, so he receives it as a teenager, as most Latter-day Saints do. And I'll just read a little bit from it, from what he writes about it. He said, "The patriarch promised that God would give me a wife and that we would raise children to maturity in this life." And Mike by then knows that of his sexuality. And he says that these words make him feel sure that this proved, despite my homosexuality, that my struggle would succeed, and that despite illnesses and accidents, I would live to maturity. So this patriarchal blessing helps convince him that, okay, I'm going to live as a straight person, and I will be able to overcome this. And it's why he chooses to follow that path.
And also that the choices wouldn't be easy, you know what I mean,
right,
to make, and may not be obvious. So let me ask both of you another question, Moshe and Barbara. After reading this memoir, some may walk away wondering, and I'm just asking what you think bluntly, did Mike love or even like himself? How would you answer that question, Moshe?
I would say that he did. I think that he did love himself. I think that he did like himself as many things, as someone that he knew himself was trying really hard to do well and to do good and to be a positive force for those he knew, and also for the church that he loved and dedicated himself to. So I really do believe that he loved himself and liked himself for those reasons. And I know that there were, struggles that he had that are, central to this book. But I don't believe myself that he disliked himself for those struggles. I'm not sure I would phrase it that way, or I don't think it would ever even occur to me along those lines. So, like, that's my sense of it.
Barbara, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you read about his teenage years, and of course, many of us as teenagers are insecure and have insecurities and don't like ourselves and so forth. But he does write about the fact that because he realizes he is gay, and what his church that he wholeheartedly believes and holds on to is teaching that homosexuality is wrong. It's a sin. It's deviant, if you will. And so he talks about struggling with not liking himself, with not liking that part of himself. He eventually comes to, and this is one of the beautiful parts of the book, I think, as an adult, after trying to live as a straight man, after living in a mixed orientation marriage for 18 years, he finally comes to accept that he was born exactly how he was supposed to be born, and that God loves his identity exactly how he is. And he comes to realize that his sexuality and his spirituality aren't two different things. They are the same. And then he comes to embrace and love himself for exactly who he is as an adult. But we see the struggle through this memoir. We see what he goes through to reach that point.
So, Moshe, what was it like reading about your father's thoughts about his marriage, your parents' sex life, and ultimately divorce? Was that weird for you?
Not especially. I mean, like, weird a little bit, I suppose, but not especially. I mean, the feeling that came up for me most was a sense of real interest and fascination, learning intimate facets, learning of intimate aspects of my father's life that I didn't have access to before. So there is that, and then there's also a sense of gratitude, that I was feeling that I do have access, to those intimate thoughts and feelings. In ways that I hadn't before. And then the other side of that is, feeling a sense of sadness that, like, it's this moment after he's passed away. And there's a little bit of, like, irony, kind of tragic and sad irony there, is that, he did share this memoir with me in 2010, on that CD-ROM that he mailed to me, which I didn't look at. And I never looked at it until after he passed away. So he did share this with me. And I'm that's definitely, like, on my mind. As being, important. It's an important detail and an important fact. But my actually, like, delving into it and accessing it, it's after the fact of his life. And now I don't have that opportunity to pursue questions, to engage my curiosity about certain things with him. And that's sad. Of course, that's a sense of loss that I have.
Clearly, your parents loved each other, though, in spite of the sexual issues between them. There was a great deal of love there.
Yeah, and I always felt that, they were always good with each other, and there was always a sense of mutual care, mutual concern, mutual consideration. Of course, in their divorce, in their marriage with this mixed orientation marriage, there was a lot of pain. There was difficulty. My mom was struggling at certain points with feeling unwanted or unloved or undesired, and then when he came out to her, it was just trying to, like, figure out how to make things work, just generally. And there was stress for sure. And, there were loud arguments and, like, shouting matches when I was young, but overall, a real feeling of mutual regard, mutual care, and mutual concern. And they divorced very amicably. Our father was always present with us, my family, and me and my siblings for every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, major family gatherings. He was always invited and often, present every year from the time of the divorce to the time of his passing. And that was a real blessing. I was always very aware of that, especially, like, with friends of mine whose parents split. I seem to be in the minority when I would mention that my parents were still in touch with each other, and that our parents were, like, hanging out with each other at these family gatherings. And I always felt, of course, very grateful, that we had that situation in the family.
Barbara, in his entries about the church history department under Leonard Arrington, what stands out to you?
Wow. So much. So anyone who's familiar with Mormon history is probably familiar with Leonard Arrington and the so-called Camelot years when he was church historian and was running the church history division at church headquarters. And I wasn't aware of the extent to which Leonard Arrington was Mike's mentor and everything he did and how much he saw Mike as probably his future predecessor. He opened doors for Mike. And so Mike is there. He's working for Leonard as a student. He doesn't even have his PhD yet, and he's working in this department. And so Mike is writing about all the intricacies, all of the backstories of the so-called Camelot years and what is known as the New Mormon history. In other words, this was the first time that professional PhD trained scholars were doing Mormon history in the department, and they're into truth telling. They're into, unvarnished, go where we've never gone before, talking about all these subjects, not necessarily to be faith promoting all the time, but just to share, forthcoming church history. It was not accepted well by church leaders at the time. This was in the 1970s. I often say that Mike was well ahead of his time. And so ultimately that department was transferred down to BYU, and Leonard Arrington was demoted, if you will. And Mike writes all about that period and everything that's going on. So that was fascinating to learn about from my perspective.
So again, back to Moshe. He talks in his memoir about telling you kids about his homosexuality. What was that like? How old were you? And what did you suspect?
Yeah, so they divorced when I was 8. And it was at this point, it was occasioned by the fact that our mother wanted to move from Salt Lake City to Missoula, Montana. And so this is in 1987 that she wants to make this move. And my brother and at least I remember myself, I didn't want to go. It just seemed like why are we going to go to this place? And my brother and I had similar feelings, and my brother's 2 years older than me. And we both thought, well, why can't we just stay with Dad? Because he just lived in this apartment, half a mile down the street in the avenues. And we asked our mother, it was like, well, okay, if you want to go to Montana, we get that, but we would rather just stay here. And just live with Dad. And she's like, well, you'll have to, I don't know. I'll talk to your dad about that. And at that time, and this is why he came out to us basically, and this is like a thing that's worth, I don't know, there's some unpacking to do there and whatnot, but he came out to my brother and I, and there's a lot to say about that, but it was occasioned by this being the explanation or the reason for why he felt, we shouldn't live with him. And what he said at the time, after this really painful, vulnerable coming out to us, after he did that with us, he said, yeah, and if I'm, if I bring a man home after a date or someone that I'm seeing, that would just be too much for you. I wouldn't want to expose you or expose you to that kind of awkwardness or something. I'm really paraphrasing, but that was the gist of what he was saying to us. And, of course, today it's like, well, there's a lot of holes in that perspective. And why is that really a reason that we, wouldn't live with you? But this is his perspective in 1987, that his being gay was the reason that we shouldn't live with him. And like I said, you can unpack that in different ways, and there's different ways to think about that. But in terms of him coming out, the thing that was really more my heart experience of that is it was incredible. It was powerful. I saw him so vulnerable in ways I'd never seen him vulnerable before. And I had seen him vulnerable. I think I'd seen him tear up or cry before, but he was scared. There was my father sitting in this room, and he was kind of fidgeting, and he had a hard time regulating his breathing, and he wasn't making eye contact with us as he was leading up to something kind of painfully slowly. He was leading up to something. It wasn't just this quick statement. He was building up to the reveal, and it took some time, and it was agonizing. I could just see that he was in agony, and it was really clear to me in my half comprehending 10-year-old way that he was scared. of the situation. He was scared of us. He was scared of how we might judge him, or scared of how we might react. And so I felt that, and it was hard to see that kind of vulnerability. I didn't have any problems myself or have any like weird feelings about him being gay. I was like more affected by his vulnerability and the sense of his struggle. It was incredibly intense for me to witness in that room that day. But no, I didn't guess. I mean, no, I had no idea. It was a surprise. But like I said, I was more